Hello, everyone. It's really great to be here today. My name is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, and I am the founder and executive director of Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, or WCAPS, as is often referred. I am here to welcome all of you to what I think will be an excellent discussion. The title of our talk is Improving Racial Diversity and Inclusion in U.S. Development Policy, Learning from Data and Experiences. And it's my pleasure to do this with the organization Center for Global Development. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join us, and I really do think you will enjoy the exchange that you will be hearing. This is an important discussion. It is important discussion because we need to look at many of our organizations, many of our federal government departments and agencies, to get an assessment of how things are going in terms of diversity and inclusion, because inclusion is such an important part of the work that we do. And it is a very important part of the policies that we should be developing to ensure that what we do really do represent various voices and the perspectives of all Americans. I personally have been engaged in many discussions that have taken place regarding the recent GAO report on the State Department. I've been part of many panels, I've listened to many panels, but I think we also need to spend a little more time as well on the recent GAO report on USAID. There are amazing individuals who work at USAID, and I've had the pleasure of working with many of them, particularly when I was in the US government recently. I did a lot of work with individuals there on the global health security agenda, which is something I worked on starting in 2013, and was able to witness the advantages that they were able to make for themselves and for the US government, and the good work that they were able to do on the ground with other US departments in the issue of infectious disease to prevent, detect, and respond. I also had an opportunity to work with many USAID colleagues in my own work when I was a U.S. representative to something called the G7 Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction. And we were at that time expanding the work that we did on biosecurity and bringing in more of the perspectives on work in infectious disease. And in doing that, I got to know quite a few individuals at USAID. And we spent many, many hours working on topics and issues related to biosecurity and infectious disease issues. So these are amazing efforts that USAID is engaged. And so this report is particularly interesting to me because in order to continue to do the great work that it does, it's very important that it has the perspectives and the viewpoints and the cultural leanings of many people who are Americans, many perspectives of people who are here from other countries, but just to ensure that they have a perspective to deal with the increasing global threats that we're dealing with these days. And we certainly need all of the perspectives and all of the expertise at the table to help us deal with issues that we're dealing with and issues that USAID as a government will also be addressing. So I am particularly interested in hearing the discussions both from USAID, from GAO, and from other experts on these issues about next steps. And as we go through these discussions, we do want you to also think about questions that you could be asking, but also as we continue the series between WCAPS and CGD on issues of development and diversity. So with that, I really would like to introduce our first speaker, very honored to welcome Jason Bear, who is a director in GAO's International Affairs and Trade team. He leads GAO's work overseeing the management of foreign affairs agencies, including the Department of State and USAID. Key oversight issues in his portfolio include diplomatic security, embassy construction, foreign service staffing and training, consular affairs, and public diplomacy. He joined GAO in June 2000. During his career at GAO, he has reviewed a variety of foreign policy issues, including international trade and counterterrorism. So welcome, Jason. We look forward to hearing from you, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Jenkins, for the very nice introduction. And thanks also to the Center for Global Development and WCAPS for convening, what is the first in, I think, going to be a great series of events focusing on diversity issues in international development. If we could go ahead and bring up the first slide. I'll go ahead and get this kicked off, and this is based on a report that we issued earlier this year, focused on USAID. As with all of our work at GAO, it was a tremendous team effort, and so I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment at the beginning just to thank the great team of people that I had the opportunity to work with doing this really great in-depth analysis. So a personal thank you to Mona, to Dave, to Cody, to Nisha, to Deirdre, and to Moon. With that, you can see the highlight of our report here on USAID is that we saw mixed progress in increasing diversity, and there were a variety of actions and recommendations we think USAID needs to implement in order to consistently meet their EEO requirements to facilitate diversity, equity, and inclusion at USAID. So why don't we go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll talk a little about the background of kind of where we're coming from here and the key issues that we think set this up. It's no surprise to anyone probably listening into this conversation, and for many of you, that there have been concerns that have been longstanding about the demographic composition of USAID's workforce. We at GAO back in 1992 had done a report where we identified underrepresentation of racial or ethnic minorities as well as women in USAID's workforce. Having said that, USAID and frankly, all federal agencies at this point do have a stated commitment to fostering a really inclusive workforce that does reflect the diversity of the United States. And in the case of USAID as well as the State Department, this is really important because they, in many cases, represent the United States to the world. They're the face of the United States government to the rest of the world. Also, for just a little bit of context and grounding, as of 2018, USAID's workforce had about 3,000 full-time permanent career employees, and they were split between the Foreign Service and the Civil Service. With that, why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide? And we'll dive into just a little description of our research objectives. We really looked at 4 basic questions. The first was about the demographic composition of USAID's workforce, and we looked at a 17-year period so that we were sure we weren't just capturing a small snapshot in time. Our second and third research questions focused on promotion outcomes from the lens of racial or ethnic minorities as well as women in the USAID workforce. And then our fourth question focused on the extent to which USAID had been able to effectively analyze its workforce and identify workforce diversity issues and take steps to address them. So moving on to the next slide, we'll jump into kind of what our methodology was. We did a number of things. First and foremost, we looked at a whole lot of personnel records. As you see in the first bullet there, we looked at about 5,750 USAID personnel who were employed in that 17-year time period. We did some descriptive analyses looking at USAID promotion data, where we were just calculating simple promotion rates for people in different categories. We also took a lot of time and effort and built a statistical model so that we could do some adjusted statistical analysis of the promotion data so that we could take account for other factors besides racial or ethnic minority status and gender that might influence promotion. And this is the point in the presentation where the lawyers would be upset with me if I didn't note that our analyses don't completely explain the reasons for differences in promotion outcomes because there are a variety of unobservable factors which can't necessarily get factored into a statistical analysis. Therefore, in our report and my remarks today, I won't be trying to draw any causal relationship between any of these demographic characteristics and promotion outcomes. Nonetheless, I think the data that we analyzed really do illuminate some areas for USAID to continue to focus on. And last but not least, we did look at a number of USAID workforce diversity reports and identified interviewed key USAID officials, as well as speaking to the employee representative groups at USAID. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide then, where we'll talk a little about, at a high level, the answer to that first research objective about changes in demographic composition. Our main message was that the overall proportion of racial or ethnic minorities did grow from 2002 to 2017, but we did note a decline in the proportion of African Americans. So as you can see in the graphic, the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities did grow from 33% to 37%. And that included growth in Asian Americans and Hispanics, but there was also a notable decline in African Americans, going from 26% in 2002 to 21% in 2018. Let's go to the next slide and we'll kind of go one layer deeper here. We thought it was important to just look at how the workforce was arrayed across the different levels. So what you see in this graphic is the various levels, whether they be GS levels on the civil service side or the classes on the foreign service side. and where racial or ethnic minorities were present in the workforce. And the bottom line is that we found that the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities were smaller in those higher ranks. So for instance, if you look on the left side of the graphic, at the GS11 or below level, you've got 75% racial or ethnic minorities, but by the time you get to the executive level in the civil service, it's down to 33%. Similarly, on the foreign service side, at class 4, you're looking at about 39% and down to 17% by the time you get to the executive level. Again, this is just a flag, one of those issues that I think warrants some continued attention. Why don't we go on, move to the next slide, please? This is where we broke down from a gender perspective, and we found that the proportion of women did increase overall, but that rise was really all in the foreign service. We did see a decline actually in the proportion of women in the civil service. And we can talk more about that, I think, during the Q&A session. Why don't we go to the next slide? This is where we focused on women in the ranks. Here we saw a similar trend to what we saw for racial or ethnic minorities on the civil service side. High representation at those lower levels, GS11 or below, but by the time you get to executives, that proportion had declined to the point where it's down to 43% in the executive ranks in the civil service side. The story was a little less clear on the foreign service side. There's not the clear and linear decline that you saw on the civil service side. To this point where we're seeing at the executive ranks, about 48% of executives in the foreign service were women. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. This is where we started our focus on promotion outcomes. And again, just as a reminder, we did some descriptive analyses where we looked at average promotion rates. So we just calculated for each of the groups what proportion of people were promoted in each year at each level. We also, as I mentioned, did these statistical models where we did the adjusted analyses so that we could take into account and control for other factors that might reasonably influence people's promotion outcomes. So for instance, we controlled for occupational group, education, language skills, whether people had been in hardship assignments, and years of federal service. Again, that's not an exhaustive list of everything that we could possibly control for, but we thought by putting those in, it would give us some insights as to where some of the real issues were. And we also looked at the civil service and foreign service separately because of the different processes and the structures of both of those service. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll take a minute and kind of describe this slide here, but this is when we talk about the results of our analysis on promotions. When we focus on the civil service side, we found that the promotion outcomes were lower for racial or ethnic minorities than for whites in the years that we looked at in the civil service. So let me just give you a quick description for how to decipher all the numbers and bars that you see in this graphic, and then it'll be repeated over the next few. So what you're seeing here is that dark black line in the middle, the vertical line, would show if there was no difference between the promotion outcomes for racial or ethnic minorities and whites, all the data would be gathered around there. When you see bars to the left, it means that promotion outcomes were lower for racial or ethnic minorities. And if it's to the right, it means that racial or ethnic minorities had higher promotion outcomes. As you can see on this graphic, most of the bars were to the left. For each promotion grade, 11 to 12, 12 to 13, etc., we have two data points. One was the descriptive analysis, that's the darker blue line, where again, that's just simply a calculation of what proportion of people in that group were promoted. So for instance, if you look at the GS11 to 12 row here, you see that darker blue line is at negative 44.4%. So what that means in real terms is that the promotion rate for racial or ethnic minorities was 44.4% lower for racial or ethnic minorities than it was for whites from GS11 to 12. That slightly lighter kind of grayish line below that, the negative 41.4% number, is the results of our statistical model. If you note on the right, you see some S's. That means that the results from our model we found to be statistically significant. For those top two bars or rows, you see there was a little bit of kind of graying, and there are NS's by those. We determined that our model, while helpful, it didn't produce results which were statistically significant, but nonetheless, we wanted to show you what the output was. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the next slide, where we'll focus on the foreign service again, from the perspective of racial or ethnic minorities versus whites. Our bottom line that we found was that the foreign service promotion outcomes were again lower for racial or ethnic minorities, especially in that early to mid-career, but the differences were generally not statistically significant. Takeaway here is, again, you see more bars to the left of the line, meaning the promotion outcomes were lower. So for instance, you see from class 3 to class 2, we found, even with our adjusted analysis in that grayish bar, a negative 21.5% lower, 21.5% lower promotion outcomes for racial or ethnic minorities. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. This is again focused back on the civil service, but through the lens of women. And we found that the civil service average promotion rates varied for women as compared with men, but the differences in the outcomes were generally not statistically significant. So that's that graying bar. And so our model didn't produce results that were statistically significant. You do see, again, those darker blue lines. There are more of those to the left in the early to the mid-career, and then there are more to the right at the 14 to 15 and GS 15 to executive levels. Why don't we go ahead and go on to the next slide? This is again focused on foreign service, where we identified that the average promotion rates were generally higher for women than for men in the time period we looked at. But again, the differences were generally not statistically significant when we added in all these other factors. So again, you can see bars on both the left side and the right side of the graph. And so the story again there is a little more mixed. And I guess that's an area to kind of further understand what exactly is going on here and why might the numbers look this way. Next slide, please. All right, so this is really a slide that encapsulates the discussion that we have in the report focused on what is USAID's kind of equal employment opportunity activity. And there are a few things that are going on in this graphic, so let me just try and explain them piece by piece. So at the top where you see that kind of greenish area, this is a representation over time starting back in 2012, looking at staffing. That green area is really the difference between the authorized level, which is that top dotted line, and the black line, which is the lower level, which is the number of actual positions that were filled. And so the green is the difference. And so you see, frankly, a persistent staffing gap in the key office that was responsible for doing these things. If I was to say a couple of good notes about this, you do see an upward trend in both of those lines, in both authorized staff levels and actual staff levels. So the trend is in the right direction, but you still have significant gaps there. Then closer to the timeline itself, we try to depict a few different things. One is just above the line, you see the tenures of the acting directors and permanent directors of the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity, where you've had a decent amount of turnover dating back to 2013. Below the line, we just saw some of the required EEO activities that we thought were particularly notable. So you see in the bright red a couple of years where USAID wasn't able to submit its annual required MD 715 report. This is something every agency has to submit to EEOC that describes the nature of their workforce and their activities in the EEO realm. The other boxes talk about instances where they weren't able to hit the required timeliness measures for conducting EEO investigations, and in a few instances when they weren't able to do an effective self-assessment of themselves and their posture for equal employment opportunity. Let's move to the next slide, which is where we kind of draw our two main conclusions. The first is that although USAID certainly has identified some diversity issues in its workforce, we do still find underrepresentation and generally lower promotion outcomes, which do suggest that there are some additional actions needed. And really addressing those things is going to require USAID to have both an effective and efficient EEO program. And our second main conclusion was that USAID's Office of Civil Rights and Diversity has for several years been unable to perform some of its key functions because they've had significant staffing gaps as well as turnover, both in leadership positions as well as staff positions. And so that's why we think that sustained attention from USAID senior level management is going to be helpful to provide both the staff resources as well as the kind of capacity to make sure that the required functions are completed in a timely manner. Let's move on to the next slide where we outline our recommendations. We had 4 of them. The first is to make sure that OCRD consistently responds to EEO equal employment opportunity complaints in a timely manner, which are specified by law. The second is to make sure that they consistently analyze the workforce demographic data for trends and, importantly, potential barriers to equal opportunity. And I look forward to having a discussion about this maybe more in the Q&A, because this is, I think, one of the most critical observations that we had. The third recommendation is to make sure that OCRD submits those required Management Directive 17 reports in a timely manner. Fourth and finally, we think that USAID senior leadership needs to demonstrate attention and focus on diversity by making sure that the key office really has the capacity to perform the required functions. We did provide USAID an opportunity to comment on the draft report. They agreed with all the recommendations, and so we look forward to working with them to identify what they've done to implement them. Let's maybe just go on to the very final slide here, which is we had a 160-page report. We kind of breezed through it in about 15 minutes. For those of you who are real data hounds, there are 100 or so pages of appendices where if you want to know more about diversity in the executive ranks or with veterans or political appointees or applicants, you can see, we certainly would be happy to direct you to the right place in the report if you've got some additional questions. And with that, I really do look forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jason, for walking through your team's findings. And we are really looking forward to exploring further during this next panel conversation. Before diving into it, I just want to take a moment to do a round of introductions for the new folks joining the event, myself included. I'm Megan O'Donnell. I'm Assistant Director for Gender and a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Global Development. And I am so pleased to be facilitating the rest of today's event with Gabrielle Gay, who is WCAPS Young Ambassadors co-chair and also a private sector engagement and impact investing coordinator at Catholic Relief Services. So for this next panel, Gabby and I will be joined again by Jason, as well as Erin Brown, who is chapter president for USAID's Chapter of Blacks in Government and a senior management analyst for USAID's Bureau for Management in the Office of Management Policy, Budget, and Performance. We just learned just a few hours ago that we unfortunately will not be joined as planned by Linda Etam, who was USAID's former assistant administrator for Africa. She had a unresolvable last minute scheduling conflict, so she will certainly be missed. But Gabby and I are so pleased to be welcoming Erin to the conversation and continuing it with Jason. What we're going to do now is I will turn things over to Gabby to have a talk with Erin and Jason. And then as you are listening to everything being discussed, please start to send us your questions and your comments for those of you tuning in. We can be tweeted at CGDev. You can leave your comments right there on YouTube, or you can email us directly at events@cgdev.org. So we hope that this will be collaborative and inclusive in form and not just in content. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabby to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan. And thank you everybody for joining us in this important discussion. So let's jump right into some of these questions, shall we? Alrighty, so my first question I want to direct towards Jason. And I just want to ask, for those of us who aren't as research or data savvy, can you frankly just tell us what we are looking at in this report and why?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And the bottom line is it's really a picture of diversity issues at USAID dating back to 2002 and showing what the trends are in terms of diversity, as well as some of the challenges, especially in the operations side of how USAID manages its EEO operations, and offering up some recommendations for how they might be able to do that effectively. Because, the reality is these are important conversations to have. And I appreciate the number of times that we've already said during this discussion, the word discussion, because that's really what this needs to come down to. We need to be willing to have open and honest discussions about these issues so that we can figure out a path forward. I'll say USAID, in our conversations with them over the year and a half that we were doing the research, was always very receptive to hearing what we had to say. And they had really positive comments on the draft report. And I think they've really taken it to heart and want to move forward in a positive and constructive way. And so that's really what this is all about.
Great, thank you. And Erin, I would love to know what your reaction was to this presentation and also a little bit about your experience at USAID.
Thanks, Gabby, and I really do appreciate WCAPS inviting me to join this panel. Was I surprised by the results of the GAO study? The honest answer is no, not really, right? I've been at the agency since 2008. I've been through different hiring mechanisms between being a fellow, an institutional support contractor, and now a direct hire. And I've seen a myriad of people come and go, especially people of color, and typically going for leaving for very similar reasons, right? Um, and what I received from the report was exactly what it said, that the results are mixed, but I think the question is, why are they mixed, right? And so when I think about um, when I was a musician, right? When I was a musician, what I was told is that I would perform like I practiced, and how I practiced was directly tied to what my intention was when it came to the performance. I either wanted to knock it out of the park, knock everyone's socks off, have a virtuoso performance, or I wanted to just barely get by, right? I just didn't want to mess up. And the mindset that one has and the level of intentionality that you have when you're practicing directly ties to what your intention is. And so what I think when I draw that parallel to USAID, I think the question from a diversity perspective is, how intentional have we been over the years, and how does that intentionality or lack thereof play into the fact that our results have been mixed between 2002 and 2018? And if you don't mind me saying a little bit further, I also was not surprised, because I believe that we as an agency have to get to a point where we see this not as EEO compliance, right? This is a national security imperative, right? We are in the midst of a global pandemic. We are in the middle of a great power competition. And what is the competitive advantage that America has? The competitive advantage that America has is the diversity of its people, the diversity, the creativity, and having one of the most educated populations in the world. And so our when it comes to national security, the agencies across the interagency should be focusing on how we can exploit that competitive advantage, which means that we need to be intentional about how we increase diversity in the representation of underrepresented groups in our respective organizations. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I think a follow-up on that last statement would be to ask this next question. So, as we know, the proportion of African American women at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, decreased from 20% in fiscal year 2002 to 14% in fiscal year 2018, contributing to overall decreases in the proportions of African Americans at USAID. Additionally, the proportion of African American women in USAID civil service decreased from 36% in FY 2002 to 23% in FY 2018. The proportion of African American women in USAID's foreign service increased from 6% in fiscal year 2002 to 7% in fiscal year 2018. So given those figures, what are your thoughts on Black women in the GAO report? What do you think contributes to these consistent decreases or extremely incremental increases?
Well, so I believe, I wish that I could give you a data-driven response, right? That may be one of the problems that we have, is that an area where we could afford to be more intentional is collecting data as to why exactly people are leaving. And so that's the consistent collection of exit surveys, both on the civil service and the foreign service side. So I wouldn't be able to give you a data-driven response for that. But here's what I do know. What I do know is on the foreign service, we now have a program, the Donald Payne Fellowship Program, which it actually attracts those from underrepresented groups and and people of color to join the Foreign Service. And so of people of color, a number of them have been Black women. And so that may result in the increase. However, when it comes to retention, we have not been able to retain Foreign Service officers. And so while we may be bringing more in, we're not bringing them in at a high enough rate in order for it to have a significant impact, as well as also having an issue with retaining. On the civil service side, I think that there are a number of factors that came into play that don't really factor into how well we've been doing from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And I do just want to give USAID a shout out. We have been doing work in the diversity and inclusion space. This in no way, shape, form, or fashion is to say that we haven't been doing anything. There have been great strides. What I will say though, is that one, if you looked at that graphic that related to promotions, when you have a highly educated workforce, such as USAID, and you have Black women that are having problems finding promotion opportunities, then what it means is that they're going to leave and go find those opportunities elsewhere, right? And so some of it is that. Some of it, of course, we did have a hiring freeze. We did, for a while, as far as the number of increases in the number of opportunities available, did have some, there were some constraints there. So that impacted everyone. However, when it comes to Black women, I believe that, again, that there were issues as it relates to promotion and the inability to be promoted, that and then factored into our ability to be able to retain Black women. And I think that one of the other things that we need to have an honest conversation about, in light of the whole conversation about George Floyd, right? The 8 minutes and 46 seconds that were felt around the world, yeah? We have had a number of conversations and a number of listening sessions at the agency as it relates to institutional racism. And so where we have yet to do work is to examine the extent to which bias and discrimination may play a part in our people's abilities to be promoted, to be hired and be promoted, and the extent to which our policies and practices allow for that to happen, right? And so I think that as an agency, if we want to be serious and we want to acknowledge that institutional racism may play a part, then we need to do what is necessary to look at our policies, our operational policies, our ADS chapters, our automated directive system chapters, and practices, and examine them to ensure that we are minimizing the opportunities for bias and discrimination to impact equity around hiring and promotion at the agency. Thanks.
Yeah, if I could maybe just add a couple things to Erin's really eloquent answer already. You know, having looked at all the data, I think there may be a couple of things that I would add to that. You know, one is, and I kind of previewed this a little bit when we were talking about our conclusions and recommendations, we think it's critically important, and this is one of the required EEO activities, is to really look at the root causes to identify potential barriers. So the numbers can only tell you so much. They can tell you what the demographics look like. They can't tell you why they look that way. And this is where you need to have people who are focused on those exact questions, who can kind of dig a little deeper and say, okay, well, why is it maybe in mid-career, let's say theoretically, we're losing a certain demographic of people? We were great at bringing them into the agency, but they're not staying. Why is that? Let's do things like the exit surveys and analyze those. Let's pull in additional information so that we can understand those. The second is, we did talk to a number of the employee groups, as I mentioned, in the course of our review. And what we were able to do is get some of the kind of anecdotes from them to understand what the issues were that were going on. And one of the issues that came up relatively regularly, and interestingly came up in our conversations with USAID, as well as our conversations with State Department employees, and that was a lack of mentorship. You know, when you think back to the numbers and the data that we presented on the proportion of people in different groups at the senior levels, when there aren't people at the senior levels that are necessarily representative of the entire population, there aren't those people who you can look up the chain and say, yep, that's a person who can help me not only be an ally in my career, but be a champion for my career, because they've been where I am and they know how I can, move forward and advance. And not having those mentors available sometimes was really an obstacle for people. I'll pause there so we can move on with the discussion, but I hope those are helpful ideas.
And may I add to that just a little bit? And I'm especially sensitive to this on the Foreign Service side. And of course, I am not a Foreign Service officer, I'm civil service. So I have to beg a little bit of ignorance here. However, when it comes to promotion, especially when I look at the data, I look at a recent fiscal year 19 Management Director 715 report, which is that annually required report. And it said that the demographic tables stated that the senior foreign service is about 80% white. FS1 levels is at about 69% white. And so when you have promotion panels that may consist of only senior foreign service and FS1s, then the question then becomes, how diverse can those promotion panels be, right? And so then you have yet another situation or another example of where the state of where we stand from a representation perspective impacts our ability to any opportunities that we have to minimize bias, minimize discrimination, and conversely increase diversity. That is not to say that it is happening. What I am saying is that's another opportunity for us to examine and just look at the realities of where we are as an organization and what creative solutions can we have in order to address situations like that. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I also wondered, and either of you can jump in on this question. According to the GAO report findings, one of the major barriers of change is the lack of high level leadership attention. So that could be from the White House or others. How do you believe we should address this challenge and deal with leaders who are unwilling to prioritize diversity and inclusion?
So I'll maybe take a first stab at it and give Erin a minute to think about how she might want to respond to that one. And I will just start by saying, this is what we've seen as a best practice for diversity, equity, and inclusion for a long time in a lot of different agencies in a lot of different settings. And so I would say this isn't necessarily something unique that we're making up in the USAID context. And that is really, as you were alluding to, key senior agency leaders have to not only say the right things, but do the right things in terms of supporting diversity and equity and inclusion, because those signal to everybody else in the organization, those leaders who are a level below, all the way down to the lowest levels of the organization, that this is something that is truly a priority. And so it's, again, not just about the words that are said and the statements that are written in diversity strategic plans and things like that, but what happens as a result? Are you carrying through on those things? Are you doing the things to make sure that there are controls in place to make sure people are treated fairly and with respect? I think that's critically important. And I think in specifically the USAID context, one of the things that we outlined is, it's in the best interest of USAID senior leadership to make sure that OCRD, the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity, has the resources and capacity to do the functions that they're tasked with doing. That's something that clearly they have responsibility for. And, I'll just note one other thing. I think in one of his final testimonies on the Hill, former Administrator Green was actually asked about diversity at USAID. It was in the context of State Department diversity, but he was asked to comment on this by one of the members. And he said, USAID has a strong commitment to diversity, and we have increased the number of people in critical roles in the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity. And so now it's incumbent on everybody to follow through and demonstrate on how that's actually making an impact and demonstrating the commitment to diversity.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing at the agency is I think that we have action that's happening in pockets, right? We have some leaders, senior leaders in our organization that are extremely committed, and they're getting down into the trenches within their bureaus and independent offices and within their missions, forming these diversity and inclusion committees, providing strategic steers to ensure that they are addressing issues specific to their individual operating units. That work is happening. I see how there are leaders that are stating that they want to measure people's performance and tie it somehow to the extent to which that staff within their operating units actually help promote diverse and inclusive environments at the agency. So that stuff is happening. And so I definitely don't want to give the impression that it's not. It again gets back to the very top of the organization, right? And as Jason was saying, we have had any number of listening sessions. There are a number of themes that have come across as a result of those listening sessions. The question is, when do we move from listening to action? Now, we do have a recent update to our diversity and inclusion strategic plan, which I do believe addresses some of these issues. But when it comes to the will, the drive, the persistence, the consistency with which we'll carry through, that will require for senior leaders to be more intentional. And I think that we have an Executive Diversity Council right now that is poised to work with their peers in order to make sure that happens.
Wonderful. And kind of a follow-up question on that point, what do you believe other international development organizations can do in partnership with USAID in order to advance these initiatives, or should be doing?
So I'll take another first stab at this one. You can take a minute to think. You can come up with an even better than I can answer than I can, Aaron, in a moment. But I would go back to the word that we were highlighting earlier, and that is discussion. You know, let's take just state and USAID. You know, two agencies which we've looked at relatively recently, and their records on diversity. I think the short answer is the two of them can learn from one another. You know, what practices are working? You know, we had the opportunity to look at these two agencies in relative parallel, even though we wrote different reports on them. And it was so fascinating to me that we saw the same kinds of issues, the same distributions on the Foreign Service side and as on the Civil Service side. And so why are you seeing differences between the Civil Service and the Foreign Service? What's working maybe on one side that's not working on the other? And if one agency has figured this out, they sure better be having those conversations with their partner agencies. I mean, you can't even, you know, count the number of calls and emails that go between state and USAID on operational issues and development issues every single day. These issues are things that they should be talking about too. And I think they can learn from one another and build on, you know, successes that they're having and learn about where they can move forward. You know, and I think Aaron or someone else may have mentioned, you know, PAIN and the Pickering program, you know, thinking about how these programs work or maybe what doesn't work and where they might need some additional authorities. Those are the kinds of conversations to have amongst themselves, and as necessary, you know, go into OMB or go into the Hill if they need additional opportunities. I think that would be really very helpful.
And so I thank you for that. So yes, discussion, starting with discussions is definitely great, but what we do know is that we do not do that on which we're not measured, right? In order for us to really, we're really going to be serious about this, we have to get to a point that at a corporate level, at an agency level, and across the interagency, actually measure ourselves, especially if this is a national security imperative, right? The extent to which we have them in our strategic plans. Right. So for many of us, we have strategic objectives that are, so we have a management goal, and that we have strategic objectives that actually speak to human capital, a lot of which is tied to employee engagement. Why not have a strategic objective with indicators and targets tied to diversity? that way that we, in our annual performance plans, annual performance reports, and that way publicly, we are stating that this indeed is a priority. We could even have it as an agency priority goal. We're saying that it is indeed a priority, and that we are going to not only hold ourselves accountable, but have the general public hold us accountable for meeting those targets. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And now we can switch gears a little bit. Erin, I know you've spoken in the past about reaching people of color at a young age to ensure they know that international development is an option, a career option. So how do you think this can best be done?
That's a great question. And for the audience, for those that are not aware, when I think of communities of color, and I'll emphasize, or I'll focus on the Black community, because that's the one that I belong to, and it's the one I'm most knowledgeable about. Despite the fact that USAID, the majority of our presence is in Africa or the African diaspora, this international development as a career opportunity is not something that is talked about in our homes. It is not something that is generally talked about in our schools. And even for those of us that go to predominantly white institutions, we may not, this may not be immediately obvious to us as a career opportunity. So that means that we need to be a little bit more strategic about our outreach. And then two, people start making decisions as to what they want to be when they grow up, when they're about the middle school, high school age range. And so what can we do there? So one, a former deputy assistant administrator for the Bureau for Management, I'll give him a shout out right now, Clinton White. He developed in coordination with the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity, developed a model USAID program, and it was targeted towards high school students. It was an agency-wide educational simulation basically the simulations that were led by Global Health, Bureau for Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance, the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and Environment, that replicated real-life crisis situations handled by USAID. So that gave high school students a bird's eye view into what we did as an agency and sparked interest. So that's one. Two, we have a number of agencies across the United States government that have paid internships for high school students. We should be doing more to increase the number of internships that we have, within the agency. And again, doing that strategic outreach to underrepresented groups. Third, we have organizations within communities of color, and again, focusing on the Black community, the National Pan-Hellenic Council. And the National Pan-Hellenic Council is a collective of historically Black Greek letter fraternities and sororities that are strongholds in the Black community, and that are community service driven, and most of them have multiple youth organizations within their ranks. And how do we leverage partnerships with organizations such as these, where we can expose youth to opportunities at USAID? I think that those three ways, especially if we're targeting at the high school level, are really solid ways in order to increase the number of at least increase interest in underrepresented groups, such that when they go to college, they make those decisions to major in those subjects that will help them in their pathway to USAID.
Absolutely. And Jason, I'm not sure if you had anything to add to that.
It was a brilliant answer. I really don't have any more specific ideas. And I think, as you've kind of emphasized previously, it's really critically important to pair together those recruiting and outreach tools with, once you've got people on board, what's our strategy for retaining those people? And what's our strategy for giving them career opportunities so they can move forward and advance and be the leaders of the next generation? And so I think that's where we're coming from. Look, take a holistic perspective. You got to kind of address whatever the particular barriers and challenges are for each aspect of it.
And just to add on to that, to what extent can we create a pipeline from high school to fellowship to actual employment at USAID, such that, again, we're tracking them along from their initial interest all the way through actually applying for a position at USAID. and doing that on the civil service side and the foreign service side. I know that we're a foreign service agency and we tend to focus on the foreign service, but we also need to do our due diligence in focusing on the civil service as well.
Absolutely. And I will say WCAPS is currently working on kind of creating a pipeline and bridging some of these gaps. So I implore everyone to kind of check them out. Wonderful organization. All right, and kind of to expand on that last question, having diversity and an inclusive foreign service and civil service, how do you think that can create more buy-in and better diplomatic results instead of pushback from country partners?
So I do believe that partner countries want to see the United States that we supposedly represent. And what I mean by that is that we are the land of opportunity. We are a melting pot. And they want to be able to see that we are walking the walk, right? Or walking the talk rather. When I think about the fact that in June, I believe recently, we had African countries that basically asked the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations to actually investigate the United States, right, for our practices of violence against people of color. I think that what they have seen is a dissonance between the America that we say and the values that we say that we represent and what that looks like in reality. And I do believe that that also plays a part in when we are representing the United States. Are we representative of the American people or of a subset of the American people? And I do believe that that we are able to achieve better diplomatic outcomes and better development outcomes as when we have senior leaders, especially that are working with government partners to achieve these outcomes, and that it may be it's actually there is a closing of the gap between the America that we claim to represent and what we actually represent. I hope that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense to me.
Here's how I look at it, and it's a great question because, again, it circles back to why does this matter? Certainly there are issues of fairness and equity and equal treatment, which are critically important, but you bring it back to a mission-focused goal, which is a great question to ask. And here I have to rely on wonderful voices that I've gotten to hear from over time. I mean, Ambassador Jenkins, could give us all a master class in answering this exact question. And I've heard Ambassador Gina Abercrombie Winstanley talk about these exact issues. And here's what I take from them and other great, powerful voices. And that is sometimes the messenger is the message. When we think about the foreign audiences and foreign governments that we're engaging with, many of them are not, where we would like them to be in terms of respect for racial or ethnic minorities or religious minorities or women in their countries. And so when we have people who represent minority communities in the United States going to foreign countries and representing the United States and the best of the United States and showing, as Aaron was talking about, the opportunities that are available to people, I think it carries a tremendously powerful message. And that's what really can illustrate, again, words and action being in alignment.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your insightful answers. Now I will bounce it back to Megan to see what questions we have from the audience.
Thank you, Gabby. There is a lot of excitement in the various chats, so I'm going to do my best to package these so we can get through as many of them as possible. One big area of interest from folks tuning in is around local ownership and the greater localization of aid that a lot of folks have as top of mind. When we think about, racial justice and inclusion, we're of course thinking about the US population, but we're also thinking about USAID's mission and the populations that it's supposed to serve. So to that, Jason, there was a question on whether GAO considered or could potentially consider down the line broadening its focus to also be looking at subcontractors and implementing partners. So not just agency staff, but who are the people that USAID is then financing to do some of the work locally within country. And also a note around diversity within staff offices. So we may be thinking about diversity sort of sitting within DC or even in some of these foreign service channels. But if we're not considering things like diversity of caste or tribe or language background within that country, how are we representing inclusively from that perspective? So start with Jason, and then Erin, for your vantage point as well, over to you after.
So it's a great question, and I welcome the opportunity. Here's the short answer. At GAO, we do our work at the request of Congress. And so when there are chairs or ranking members who are of relevant committees who are interested in us doing work, we're happy to do that for them. Or when they write it into a mandate in law, we're happy to do that work for them. And I think here's how I look at this. These two reports that we put out on State Department and USAID diversity really laid a lot of the groundwork. And there's great material, as we've been talking about for an hour already. But in many ways, it more prompts additional questions, just like the ones that have been asked here. We haven't looked into those things in the past. Our audit authority is really about the US government agencies. And so the implementing partners part might be a little more challenging. I don't know what the availability of the data is. But we're happy at the request of folks in Congress to look into those issues, because I think they are really interesting issues to really kind of get behind in terms of the efficacy of what the diversity efforts are.
Yeah, and so I think it's a fair question for a number of reasons. One, the GAO report consists of data that only represents a third of our workforce, right? So direct hires only represent a third, with a large portion, the largest portion being foreign service nationals. And also we have a large PSC and institutional support contractor presence. And so the question then becomes, one, what is the agency's learning agenda as it relates to diversity and inclusion, right? Because in order for us to get a complete picture of diversity at USAID, then we have to factor in those hiring mechanisms into account. So what will and while I respect the question being, will GAO be willing? I think the question really is, will USAID be willing to actually put in the effort to collect the data that's necessary in order for us to have a more complete and accurate picture? And I think that and of course, I can't speak for the agency, but I know that there's been enough conversation around this where there's an acknowledgement that in order for us to really speak about the state of diversity at the agency, that we have to have a complete data set, which includes our presence in country. Oh.
Seems like an excellent opportunity for follow-up. We can touch base with WCAPS on that after. Relatedly, Erin, to that last point about making sure that we have sort of comprehensive data, and you brought it up earlier by saying, basically what gets measured gets done. There's also a lot of interest around intersectional discrimination, right? So Gabby and myself and others in preparing for today were really struck by the fact that so much of this gap is accounted for within the population of African-American women specifically, right? So it's that intersection of race and gender that's making these challenges compound. And folks have asked about migrant status, about disability status and differently abled persons, parental status, these sexual orientation, these other considerations that maybe in a future iteration we'd also want to consider. Over to either of you to comment on those different facets of what we should be considering down the line.
Hi, look, this gets back to what is the learning agenda around diversity and inclusion, right? And that includes the question around intersectionalities. What I will say is that some of those questions included the need to collect data that we don't currently collect, right? And so when I specifically think about gender and sexual minorities, we don't collect data, right? And so the agency needs to ask itself, if we truly want to get to being able to describe how the agency is doing with communities where, especially where there's intersectionality, that we need to be able to collect the data. And I wish I had a better answer for that, but I think the answer is follow the data, right? You know, and we'd be able to have that answer if we had the data, but it's, to my understanding, that data just does not exist. Over.
Yeah, and I would agree with Erin. I mean, we certainly in preparing our research came into some of those issues about the lack of data. And it's kind of ironic, the guy who, you know, just had all those slides with all those numbers and bar graphs and wrote a 160-page report with all those appendices. I'm going to say, I think an important part of it is pairing together the quantitative and the qualitative. And so when I talked before about doing those analyses to understand the potential barriers to equal opportunity, identifying what those triggers are, the data can be really helpful in seeing those maybe in the first instance, but you've got to really get deeper behind that. And so that's why it's important to be engaging with those employee representative groups that can tell you the stories behind what's going on here and can help you see maybe some of those issues of intersectionality. Because again, the numbers can tell you certain things. They can tell you how things look. They can't tell you why they look that way. And in order to really have long-lasting, durable solutions on some of these diversity and equity and inclusion issues that are so critical, you really have to get behind that layer and understand what are the root causes here, because that's how you're going to come up with the solutions that are going to work.
It's a really valuable point. Thank you both. And then maybe speaking to that why, you know, it came up in conversation with Gabby and Jason. I know you highlighted it in your initial presentation that we seem to have this sort of sticking point in retention. So even if we are successful in getting folks recruited, hired, in the door in the first instance, right? You're seeing this sort of gradual barrier over time of being able to get promoted, you know, level upon level. So switching to that sort of qualitative perspective, Erin, having been at USAID for a while, you know, would love to hear your vantage point on what some of that may be driven by. And then Jason, you know, in your broader conversations around the report's publication, if you've been engaged in that sort of why conversation as well. Over to you after.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about now is that we're getting beyond numbers and getting towards felt experience, right? And in order for the agency to understand where the retention issues are, it has to get to a point where it can better understand the felt experience of underrepresented groups, be it because people of color, those that are disabled, gender, sexual minorities, et cetera. We have to get beyond data and get to the felt experience. And, you know, as it'll soon be 4 years that I've been the chapter president for USAID's chapter of BIG, and the number of tears I've seen shed, and the frustration, the dismay, the demoralization that I've seen from people of color is real. And it's not like they have not been saying it. Is the question really is, has it been listened to, and what has been done about it? And so again, in pockets across the agency, we have leaders that are out there doing the work, that are being intentional, that are prioritizing it. And I understand that it is extremely difficult amidst all the priorities that we have as an agency to prioritize issues related to diversity and inclusion. But when it comes to the ability to attract and retain a talented, diverse, qualified workforce, and the cost to the agency just to ramp people up and bring them up to speed and get them to where they can actually be productive, contributing, employees, it is worth the investment in examining how we can better improve retention of diverse peoples. And again, we need to get to a point where, well, one of the things that I do want to highlight is that I know that this is not a focus group or an interview, but we do have a survey that went out, and there was a similar one that went out at State Department for FSOs of color. And we just closed that survey, so we don't have the analysis on that yet. But I suspect that we will see that we did have a number of, as far as open comment field questions that really get down to what people experience, the microaggressions that they experience, how they feel that promotions may have been denied promotions based upon their color. I think their skin color. I think that we will see some of that come out. Is that representative of the entire agency? No, it's not. But we have to get to a point, getting back to Jason's earlier point about being ready to have those honest conversations. We need to be able to have those honest conversations, and then we have to then quickly pivot to action that addresses what are the policies, practices, processes, behaviors, enabling systems like reward and recognition to reinforce the culture, inclusive culture that we want at the agency, which also will stand to help us attract and retain more diverse talent.
I would agree with everything that Erin said, and I unfortunately don't have the answer to the kind of proverbial $64,000 question of why. But I think a lot of the things that Erin already outlined are the answer to how you're going to get to why, how you're going to understand what those potential barriers are. It's by looking at the data, identifying what the triggers are. What are these issues of intersectionality that need to be studied more? How do you engage the employees in helping understand at greater depth what are the issues going on and what are potential solutions to them? And this is, I think, the process that we really are encouraging USAID management to embark on. So if they honestly follow all those steps and put in the hard work and get people on board who can focus on these issues like a laser, I'm confident that they can get to the answer of why, and then they can come up with those solutions that get to root causes. And I think that's where all of us kind of want us to end up.
Thank you both. Yeah, it's encouraging even from question and response to question and response to have just heard Jason recommend the need for that qualitative analysis. Erin, for you to have just shared that that is already going to happen thanks to the survey that you've generated. So yeah, I think we'll all look forward to seeing some of the outcomes of that next stage. Jason, we've got a couple of just data-oriented questions for you popping up just to give some folks comparison points. You've been so helpful in walking through the data for the agency specifically. How does that compare to other agencies, to national averages, in comparison to the broader context? Where does this stand?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the short answer is it's complicated. Whether you're looking at the national population writ large, whether you're looking at like census data on the relative civilian labor or relevant civilian labor force. So let me just give you the easiest analogy that I can, again, because we just finished the work looking at the State Department. Again, at a very overall high level perspective, at USAID, we saw the proportion of racial or ethnic minorities go up from 32 to 37%. At State Department, we saw the same proportion go from 28% to 32%. So we saw marginal growth in both. Also below that, there were areas for concern, but USAID is ahead of State Department in this perspective. That's not to say that they've figured out the solution. And we've talked, for an hour already about some of the areas that require additional focus, but USAID is ahead of some of the other key foreign affairs agencies, as well as some of the other general population measures.
Good to know. And then Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you for the last word in this section. A number of folks have commented on the fact that some of the recommendations that came out of the report focus on addressing complaints and to have the staff and the resources at that stage. But obviously, as you've noted during this discussion, it's a little bit late in the game, right? And we want to be reaching folks early and young through hiring and recruitment. So would just love to hear, from your experience in the agency and more broadly, is there anything we haven't touched on yet that should be a recommendation, right? In addition to sort of those later stages.
Yeah. So, I was an EEO counselor for a few years. And one of the things that I would have to say is that, and I've said this in some of our um, internal sessions, is that the agency has we've been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion with very little conversation around race, racism, and discrimination, right? Because it happens clearly, and all of those things are captured, and all allegations are captured on 462 reports that go to the EEOC and all of those things, and so we know it happens. The question is that when former Administrator Green in 2018 said that the agency has a zero tolerance for discrimination and zero tolerance for harassment. What does that mean exactly, right? And how do we operationalize that in such a way that we don't get to the EEO cases, right? Because if we get to zero tolerance, then we should see a precipitous drop in the number of allegations that we receive. But what is the level of intention for the agency? We've had a sustained effort towards addressing a whole action alliance on preventing sexual misconduct, right? That gets to the zero tolerance towards harassment, but specifically sexual harassment. Then the question then becomes, what is it for harassment writ large and for discrimination? And I think that once we get to that, then we'll be closer to where we want to be insofar as how do we get to address these issues before they become EEO complaints.
Erin, Jason, thank you so much for taking the time to have this very important and challenging conversation with us. We'll hope to continue it. But for this last stage, now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Clifton Keenan, who is Diversity and Inclusion Division Chief at USAID's Office of Civil Rights and Diversity. Clifton, we are so glad that you are also able to join us today. Hi. I'm going to pass it back to Gabby to walk us through some questions that we have for you, and then I'll wrap up.
Thank you. All right, Gabby, let's have it.
Let's go. Thank you so much, Megan. So first, I would like to ask you what your reactions are to our other panelists' remarks. Did you find any of their anecdotes or responses surprising? Do you have any personal experiences that you'd like to share that come to mind, or that came to mind while you were listening?
So I want to say to my colleagues and dear friends that spoke, I just really want to honor and appreciate you. I'm not going to say that anything was surprising, but I will say that it took a tremendous amount of self-reflection and vulnerability for these colleagues to say that, and I do want to honor and acknowledge that. You know, offices of civil rights and diversity exist for a reason. A type of job like mine exists for a reason, and honestly, I left my professional backstop of being a nurse and birthing babies because I wanted to make a difference in this space, right? So I'm a diversity officer whose background is as a labor and delivery nurse who studied marginalization and discrimination through doctoral and postdoctoral education. I'm here because I want to make a difference, and there are clearly things that we need to continue to be intentional about advancing. So when I hear what the outcomes of the GAO report were, I want to go very clearly on record to say, listen, USAID acknowledges that what was in the GAO report was valid and is certainly a very valid framework for us to use to advance the things of which there had been deficiency in the past. As far as lived experience, as a qualitative researcher, I believe in phenomenology and ethnography as the keys to the soul and the revelations of truth. And when I think about understanding lived experience, the GAO report did a lot to help us quantify things. But as our colleague said, there's so many more things that need to happen as it relates to understanding lived experience. And as a part of my job and on behalf of the agency, I know that the commitment is there, and we've done some incredibly forward-leaning things to try to dive into that. USAID is not above criticism, and the GAO is there to hold us accountable. And for that, I'm very appreciative, not only as an employee of USAID, but also as a citizen of the United States. So let's keep the conversation going, Gabby.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'll move on to the next question then. I'll skip what your reactions to the GAO report were, since you just gave us some. Can you talk a little bit about diversity training at USAID? And can you briefly explain what the Office of Civil Rights and Diversity does, their procedures to meet those different EEO responsibilities? So what do both include and how could they be improved?
Okay. So, as a GAO report was being done, there were an incredible amount of efforts happening concurrently to attend to some of the deficiencies that we acknowledge were there, and many of them are no longer there. So as far as the diversity, equity, and inclusion training, I'm going to call a lot of what we've been doing capacity building and empowerment. My model has been to meet people where they are so we can collectively walk together to where we want to be. And one of the things that we've done is we have outlined a universal curriculum in our new diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy on behalf of our agency. And this ensures that the narratives, the framing, and all of the things that go along with that, whether you're in Washington or whether you're in Mozambique or whether you're in Timor-Leste, that curriculum is somewhat uniform with some caveats for local culture and experience. That's a step that we've moved forward, so it wouldn't be up to each individual operating unit to try to figure out what they needed to do, nor would it necessarily rely on USAID corporate to actually roll out every individual training and they be that actually specific. So that's one of the things that we're doing. Every year we have an unconscious bias blitz. Our training is at the senior leadership level as it relates to hiring panels, as it relates to EEO compliance, anti-harassment, as it relates to reasonable accommodation. Other trainings that we're doing at USAID, we do microaggression training. We do trainings around everyday inclusion, diversity 101, right? We do an unconscious bias for senior leaders, and then we do it everyday unconscious bias. We're utilizing the Project Implicit Harvard Implicit Association tests through accountability groups as we think about standing up new bureaus to try to reveal. We're doing capacity building and training around what we call positive interrupters, where we're identifying people whose primary role on hiring panels and review panels is to actually interrupt and mitigate things that might look like bias coming into different processes and procedures. A lot of these things are at infancy level, and they're incredibly innovative and forward-leaning when you think about the United States government, but there's tremendous interest, and we're seeing a lot of scale happen. And we believe with the formalization of the strategy that's coming out, as well as the continued interest and the current momentum in the universe, that we're going to see these things actually go to scale in an accelerated way. Now, as far as EEO, I just want to highlight a couple of things because there are things that were in the GAO report I think were incredibly valid, and they were likely concerning to people that read it. But I will tell you, in live time now, there is no EEO backlog. The staffing shortages in OCRD have been completely rectified. In all actuality, we increased our overall positions by over 50%, adding 10 FTEs in just 1 year. And one of the teams that was created out of those 10 FTEs was a team called the Affirmative Employment Team. And there was 3 positions directly dedicated to doing things such as the MD 715, following and tracking the barrier analysis, looking at triggers, analyzing data and looking at it longitudinally, as well as incorporating the qualitative aspects for proof of concept. That being said, our affirmative employment program that we're standing up, of which we have the positions hired for, is also going to be crosswalking the principles of that beyond our direct hire workforce, because the majority of our workforce is non-direct hire. The last thing that I will say is not only are our EEO complaint, the backlog, caught up, the response rate now is on par, and our MD 715 report was actually submitted on time and is available for public consumption. So I say all that to say this: things like the GAO report are inherently good because they provide a check and balance. And I'm going to tell you, USAID has worked hard, and the Office of Civil Rights Diversity has done significant work to become in compliance. That does not mean that we should become comfortable. It does not mean that we figured out everything, nor does it mean that we can now relieve ourselves of all criticism.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That's wonderful that all of those roles have been filled. Just to go down a rabbit hole slightly.
All right, I'm ready.
I wonder, when you were talking about all of the training that USAID is embarking on, already doing and planning on doing, how do you see that kind of translating to the development sector as a whole? Will these be things that you would require of folks or organizations that are seeking funding?
So that's a good question. And I've been invited to some preliminary conversations to help start thinking through what that looks like. As we think about our core values at USAID, and we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, equal opportunity being a core value, when we think about funding things such as some of our employment contracts, we are making steps towards ensuring that those core values are represented in those things. You know, I believe as we increase capacity, awareness, and promote accountability and positive empowerment and interruption, you know, for those of us like myself who come from the program side of the house, that has a trickle-down effect. So what is important to us every day at USAID by virtue becomes important to us in our programming. So as we think about funding new awards and those that would have the agency to influence those processes, as they come to terms that a core value and an advantage that we have, something we should be proud of, is our diversity and inclusion, I believe that we will see more intentionality of that being reflected in our work that we do beyond just our internal employment. But I invite individuals to be positive interrupters alongside our staff.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And also I wanted to know, we spoke a little bit earlier, some of our panelists noted that turnover was a particular issue at USAID, and particularly in your department. I wondered how you were going to address, I mean, you have filled all of these roles, the backlog is taken care of. How do you plan to keep these people in those positions, I suppose? Yeah.
So my concern is not as much with keeping people in the positions as it is people being empowered, valued, and celebrated while they are in those positions. At some point, you know, if you want to advance your career, you know, I was birthing babies. You know, they didn't lose me from the reproductive health side of the house because I didn't like my job. It was time for me to go where I felt called and to do something differently. One of the things we call for in our new updated strategy is that we call for universal exit interviews across all hiring mechanisms. And we need to understand why people are leaving. And we need to be able to track that and look at it longitudinally. And we need to be able to disaggregate and triangulate it based upon different parts of the agency. If people are leaving because they found better opportunities, I would say in the EEO civil rights world, that's a transferable skill that goes to every single agency, right? So if you have that backstop, you could go and work at any other agency in the government. And if you wanted to advance your career and you found advancement opportunities, I think USAID should be very proud that it empowered people to advance their careers throughout the government. I think where we need to be sure is that people are not leaving because they see a glass ceiling. They feel as though they're being marginalized. They do not feel as though they're being celebrated, applauded, or substantively being involved in decisions that impact their work, backstop, and everyday environment. When that happens, I think it's time to talk about conversations and hold people accountable. And I believe our agency is at the space now where we're ready to do that. I cannot speak for always, but now there is very clear messaging from our senior leadership about accountability. Our new diversity and inclusion strategy delineates accountability at 3 levels: the agency level, the operating unit level, and then at the individual level. And one of the things when we think about the individual level is holding people accountable for doing things like microaggressions in the workplace that may create an environment that people see no other choice but to leave, and therefore they exit.
Noted. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to highlight the GAO report's 4 recommendations. So one was responding to complaints. The second was analyzing trends. The third was submitting the MD 715 report, which you said is either published or on its way.
It's there. Go look at it.
And 4 was ensuring senior leadership allocates the attention to matters of diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely.
I wondered, what are some specific actions USAID is taking in order to advance all 4 of these recommendations? You mentioned some things that were in the works already. And yes, I just wanted to know if there was anything else to add.
So we have a functional executive diversity council. I'm not going to speak to the past. It's always been there, but we have a functional executive diversity council that made the transition from an information sharing platform to actually an actionable platform. These people are in the trenches with trying to figure out strategies, and these are senior executives within the agency that are engaging with employee resource groups and OCRD to collectively work on things like the strategy efforts and resourcing to advance things. Like I said, the staffing in OCRD has increased by over 50%. We have more positions than we ever did, and we've stood up 2 new teams, and we have created foreign service positions to have foreign service positions also working within the OCRD EEO space. That also included standing up the anti-harassment program and completely streamlining and restructuring our reasonable accommodation program. All of those things required resourcing, they required commitment, and they required the senior leaders to get behind them. And there's evidence that they did, because some of these positions were done during times of increased scrutiny around hiring in the federal government. As far as the EEO complaints, I think we've talked about them. We continue to look at our customer service to make sure that we're meeting our consumers where they are and maintaining our neutrality as an office. And in partnership with our ERGs and other foreign service agencies, we are doing benchmarking to make sure that we are aligned and utilizing best practice as it relates to attending to complaints. At USAID, by virtue of policy, we accept EEO complaints from both direct hires and those that are non-direct hire, meaning that locally employed staff, foreign service nationals, third country nationals would be able to avail themselves to some forms of the EEO and the anti-harassment process, which is something I'm incredibly proud about, and our additional resources have allowed us to create greater capacity as it relates to that. The last thing that I will say on behalf of the senior leadership, when I think about our acting administrator and I think about our office director, acting office director, Ismael Martinez, they have been forward-leaning. They have taken risk. They have done out-of-the-box things. You know, we were discussing racism starting on the Monday that we came back after everything happened over the weekend in the country. You know, there was not discussions about if we're going to do it. The discussions were what. And we had very raw and timely conversations about racism, discrimination, marginalization, intersectionality. You know, and I've worked at several other government agencies, and I know firsthand, you know, that was not happening everywhere, and we had the full support. You know, we elevated Juneteenth to being agency commemoration, right? Juneteenth has been around my entire life. I've been celebrating Juneteenth. I never worked anywhere where they celebrated Juneteenth. And these are things that we're doing at USAID that send a very clear signal that you are appreciated, you do belong, and that across all of the diasporas that are represented within our workforce, there's space for you to be unique and to be awesome. I will say this, despite everything that we're doing, there is still room for positive interruption. There's room for criticism, and there's room for people to be checks and balances for us. The momentum that we're seeing today, it needs to sustain itself. There needs to be a continual pipeline of people that are doing this work. I asked someone the other day what guidance counselors are telling their students that being a chief diversity officer is a career path that they can walk into. So when we think about pre-service, I would love to see a better pipeline of people that are prepared to do EEO and civil rights work, because most people fall into these jobs in sort of a serendipitous way. That's all I have to say. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues again, and particularly thank you to the GAO. Those type of external reports are incredibly important. As a researcher and a scientist, I know firsthand that having objective evaluations from third parties is inherently a good quality assurance measure for every organization. And I look forward to continuing to work with GAO and your organization and others in a very transparent and harmonious way to advance what's in the national interest of every single American and those that we touch. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so, so much. I just want to reach back to one point that you made in terms of being successful in all of these initiatives and ventures is resourcing. So we definitely, it's very important to resource appropriately these types of initiatives. So thank you once again.
And I agree 100%. And whether those resources be financial, whether they be time commitments, whether they be human resources, collateral resources, I think thinking about resources in a diverse way is directly tied to this today more than ever.
Absolutely. And now I'll bounce it back to Megan to close us out. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Clifton, and a huge shout out and thank you for managing
you.
childcare simultaneously with all of this. You did great. I just want to close quickly by saying that as Ambassador Jenkins mentioned at the start, today's conversation focused on USAID, but we recognize, of course, that many of our own organizations still have progress to make to improve racial diversity and inclusion. So we are really excited to continue to work together with WCAPS to move this agenda forward, to be those checks and balances that Clifton mentioned for ourselves and for US agencies. So from today's discussion, it's clear that there are opportunities to get even more intersectional in the data that we collect and analyze, broaden the scope of these types of reviews to look at the rest of USAID staff and implementing partners, and look across all stages from, as Erin mentioned, making children aware of development as a potential career pathway to hiring, recruitment, promotion, advancement. And so with that, I just want to say a final thank you to all of our speakers, to our partners at WCAPS, and to all of the folks behind the scenes, both at CGD and WCAPS, who made today's conversation possible. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.